What happens when a woman, exhausted from traveling, is turned away from a luxury hotel simply because she is black? Where does she turn when faced with blatant discrimination? Will her voice be heard or will she be silenced? Follow this story of resilience, justice, and the fight for dignity. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Grace Thompson, a 70-year-old black woman with weathered yet strong features, stepped into the grand lobby of the Hilton Tower Hotel in Los Angeles. Her small suitcase rolled behind her, the wheels clicking softly against the marble floors. She had been on the road for hours, traveling across states to reach this hotel, and the exhaustion was evident in every step she took. Her knees ached from the long journey, and the pain in her lower back was almost unbearable, but she pushed it aside. All she wanted was a moment of rest, a comfortable bed, and peace. The Hilton Tower greeted her with its luxurious grandeur. The lobby stretched high with towering ceilings, the air heavy with the fragrance of fresh flowers and the faint hum of quiet chatter. Gleaming chandeliers hung from above, their crystals sparkling like diamonds in the soft lighting. The polished marble floors reflected her every movement, adding to the almost surreal beauty of the space. The rich, dark wood accents and plush velvet seating in the lounge added to the sense of opulence. But for all its splendor, something felt off. As Grace pulled her suitcase closer to the front desk, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in her chest. The hotel was beautiful, yes, but there was an unease in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place. It wasn't the building that made her feel this way, it was the people. As she walked toward the desk, she could feel the eyes of the other guests following her every move, the stares too long, the whispers too quiet. Grace had learned to recognize these subtle cues over the years, the slight stiffening of posture, the hesitancy in the way people looked at her, the unspoken discomfort. She ignored the glances, pushing past the unease as best she could. The years of being the only black woman in certain spaces had made her resilient to this. She kept her head high, determined not to let anyone make her feel small. She approached the front desk, offering the young receptionist a tired but polite smile. "Good evening. I have a reservation under Grace Thompson," she said, her voice steady but weary as she placed her confirmation number on the counter. In her mind, she only had one thing on her mind: rest. The rest of the world, however, was not so accommodating. Grace Thompson walked up to the front desk, her small suitcase clicking against the marble floor with each step. The weight of her long journey tugged at her body, her tired eyes scanning the lobby as she approached the counter. She had traveled for hours, and all she wanted now was to check in, kick off her shoes, and relax. She placed her reservation details on the counter with a tired but polite smile. "I have a reservation under Grace Thompson," she said, her voice calm, though her exhaustion was palpable. The young receptionist looked up, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. There was an awkward silence before she spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no reservation under that name." Grace's stomach clenched. She had booked the room weeks ago, paid in full. There was no way this could be right. "That's impossible," she said, her voice steady despite the creeping frustration. "I paid in advance. Could you check again?" The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, but before she could respond, a sharp, cold voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" A woman, tall and impeccably dressed with a gold nameplate reading Amanda Stevens, stepped forward. Her eyes swept over Grace dismissively and she crossed her arms over her chest. "We're fully booked," Amanda stated flatly without even looking at the screen. "There's no room available." Grace's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. This wasn't right. "I made a reservation weeks ago. I've already paid." "Is there anyone else I can speak to?" Amanda's tone was abrupt and dismissive. "I'm the manager. There's no one else to speak to. Grace felt a tightening in her chest, but she refused to back down. She took a deep breath and looked Amanda in the eyes. I insist you check again. I have confirmation and I've paid in full. Amanda's gaze grew colder and she glanced at the receptionist, who nervously glanced back at the screen before stepping aside. There's nothing I can do, Amanda repeated, her voice sharp. We don't have a room for you. You need to leave. Grace could feel the humiliation rising in her chest. She had booked this room months ago, paid for it, and yet here she was being treated like she didn't belong. She had been in situations like this before, where people tried to brush her off, but this was different. This time, she wasn't going to let it slide. I'm not leaving until I speak to someone who can explain why I'm being treated this way, Grace said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. Amanda's eyes narrowed, and she gave a quick, dismissive wave to the security guard standing nearby. The tall, broad-shouldered man began walking toward Grace, his expression unreadable. Grace didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands at her sides, her back straight. I'm not causing a disturbance. I simply want the room I paid for, she said, holding her ground. The security guard stopped in front of her, blocking her path. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Grace's heart raced, but she refused to be intimidated. I'm not leaving without a resolution. I have a right to be here, she said, her voice unwavering. Amanda's smirk was almost too much to bear. You really think calling someone else is going to change anything? The hotel is full, she sneered. I don't think that's the issue, Grace shot back, her voice calm but firm. I think you're trying to push me out for a reason and I won't let you. The security guard shifted slightly, but didn't make a move. Grace held up her phone, showing the confirmation email. I'm not leaving. I'll wait until someone higher up comes to speak with me. Amanda's face flushed with irritation, but she didn't back down. The security guard remained where he stood, though his stance softened slightly, unsure of what to do next. Grace wasn't backing down, and neither was she. The tension in the lobby thickened as Amanda motioned sharply toward the security guard standing by the entrance. He was a tall, burly man, his black uniform barely containing his muscular frame. Grace's chest tightened as he started walking toward her. Ma'am, the security guard said, his voice deep and commanding, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Grace's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected this level of aggression. She had done nothing wrong, paid for her reservation, followed the rules, and yet she was being treated like an intruder. She felt the sting of unfairness deep in her chest. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her throat. I'm not leaving until someone higher up addresses this. The security guard paused, looking her over for a moment before taking another step forward, his large frame now blocking her from the front desk. Grace met his gaze, unwavering, her hands still clenched by her sides. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to let this man push her out without a fight. I'm not causing a disturbance, she continued, her voice calm but firm. I've paid for a room. I've followed the process. I'm entitled to stay. The security guard didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He glanced toward Amanda, whose expression remained cold and unbothered as she observed the scene unfold. Grace could feel Amanda's dismissive gaze, but she wasn't going to let that discourage her. I understand you have a job to do, Grace said, her voice softening slightly, but I have a paid reservation and I have a right to be here. The security guard shifted his weight slightly, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't want to escalate things, but he was clearly caught between his duty and Grace's insistence. Grace could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't seem convinced that what he was doing was right. I'm not going to leave without speaking to someone who can actually help me, Grace said, her tone unwavering. For a moment, the guard didn't respond. He stood there, caught in the middle, his gaze flicking between Grace and Amanda, who was now tapping her foot impatiently. The tension was palpable, the eyes of other guests in the lobby on them, but Grace wasn't going to back down. "I'm asking you to leave, ma'am," the security guard repeated, though his voice had softened slightly, as if he was questioning his own orders. "I'm not leaving without answers," Grace insisted, her resolve growing stronger. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm a paying guest and I expect to be treated as such. If you want to call someone else or you need to verify anything, do that. But I'm not going to walk away just because it's easier for you." The security guard hesitated, looking at Amanda once more. His discomfort was becoming more visible. He didn't seem to want to be part of this escalation, but his hesitation wasn't enough to stop Amanda's icy demeanor from tightening. Finally, after a long pause, the security guard stepped aside, signaling that he wasn't going to force her out, at least not yet. Grace could feel a small victory in the moment, but it wasn't over. She stood her ground, her back straight, refusing to let the pressure of the situation force her into submission. She had made it clear, she wasn't leaving without speaking to someone who could resolve this. "I'll wait," Grace said, crossing her arms, her gaze never leaving Amanda. She wasn't going to let Amanda's dismissive attitude win. Amanda's face darkened with frustration, but there was nothing more she could do, at least not yet. She glanced briefly at the receptionist, then back at Grace, but Grace didn't look away. The power had shifted, even if only slightly. Grace wasn't leaving, not until she had answers, not until she was treated with the respect she deserved, and she would make sure everyone in the lobby knew she wasn't going to back down. With that, she stood still, waiting for the next move. Grace stood firm, feeling the tension in the room weigh heavily on her. Amanda's smug expression never faltered, even as the situation grew more uncomfortable. Grace had made her stand clear, but it wasn't enough, until now. The automatic doors slid open once more, and Grace knew who had arrived before she even had to look. Thomas Jenkins entered the lobby, his presence filling the space as he moved with quiet authority. His tailored gray suit was sharp, and his confidence was unmistakable. The air shifted immediately. People turned their heads, and the temperature of the room seemed to rise. Grace could feel the energy change as she met his eyes, a silent understanding passing between them. Amanda, still oblivious to the significance of the man before her, continued speaking dismissively. "I really don't know why you're still here," she said, her tone mocking as she waved toward the door. "You think calling your son is going to change anything?" Thomas, without a hint of emotion, stepped closer to the front desk. Amanda's voice faltered when she finally realized he wasn't just some random guest. "Who are you?" she sneered. Thomas's response was swift and cool. "I'm the owner of this hotel," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Amanda's face froze. She blinked, disbelief settling over her. For a moment she couldn't speak. Grace watched as the arrogant woman crumbled, her confident posture turning stiff and uncertain. Her smirk faded as the reality of the situation hit her. I didn't realize." Amanda stammered, her words tangled in her throat. Thomas didn't allow her to continue. "You didn't think my mother was important enough to be treated with respect. Now you'll face the consequences." Grace could see the panic rising in Amanda's eyes, and for the first time, the manager seemed small and vulnerable. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You're done here," he said. Amanda, stripped of her previous confidence, turned silently, escorted out by the same security guard who had once been called to remove Grace. Grace didn't look away. The silent victory was sweet. The lobby remained tense as Thomas stood firmly at the front desk, his gaze unwavering as he addressed Amanda. Grace felt the atmosphere shift immediately, the oppressive weight of the situation lifting as Thomas spoke. "Amanda," he said calmly, "you're fired." The words sliced through the tension like a knife. Amanda's face drained of color, and for the first time, Grace saw the manager falter. The cold confidence she had carried so effortlessly moments ago was gone, replaced by shock and disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Grace could tell Amanda knew she had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. "You can gather your things and leave now," Thomas continued, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable authority in it. "You've treated my guest, my mother, with disrespect, and I won't tolerate that kind of behavior at my hotel." Amanda stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling at the counter as she tried to regain her composure. The smirk that had once seemed so sure of itself was gone, replaced by uncertainty. She opened her mouth again, perhaps to argue, but the words didn't come. The security guard, who had been standing silently by the entrance, stepped forward and gestured for Amanda to follow him. There was no resistance. She didn't try to argue or plead. Her shoulders slumped as she turned to leave, escorted out of the hotel by the same security guard who had once been called to remove Grace. As Amanda disappeared from the lobby, Grace felt the atmosphere shift. The tension that had been so thick was finally starting to dissolve. Staff members who had been watching the scene unfold exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they realized the injustice that had just been corrected. Thomas turned toward Grace, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice sincere. "That's not how we do things here. You deserve much better than that." Grace smiled faintly, the weight of the ordeal slowly lifting. "Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate it." Thomas nodded, then turned to the receptionist who was still nervously hovering behind the counter. "Jasmine, make sure Grace's reservation is handled properly. Give her the best room we have and make it complimentary. This is on us as an apology for the inconvenience." Jasmine quickly processed the information, visibly relieved. "Of course, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her hands moving swiftly over the keyboard. "It's all taken care of." Turning back to Grace, Thomas added, "I know that this doesn't undo what happened, but we'll make sure your stay is perfect from here on out. You're more than welcome here." Grace felt a warmth spread through her at his words. It was rare to have someone acknowledge the emotional toll of such an experience, but Thomas had done more than just acknowledge it. He had acted on it. "I really appreciate that," Grace said, her voice quieter but filled with gratitude. Jasmine handed Grace the key card, a hint of a smile on her face. "Your suite is ready, Miss Thompson. We've upgraded you to the penthouse, and all room service is complimentary for the rest of your stay." Grace blinked in surprise. "The penthouse? You really don't have to do this." Thomas smiled, though it was a gentle, reassuring smile. "It's the least I can do." "No one should be treated like that, especially not you." Grace nodded, still processing the unexpected kindness. She had been made to feel invisible, less than human, but now she was being treated with the respect she had always deserved. It was a strange but welcome feeling, and for the first time since she'd walked into the hotel, she felt at ease. She took the key card and turned toward the elevator. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." "Take your time to rest," Thomas said. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." Grace nodded, her heart feeling lighter as she walked toward the elevator. The journey had been long and the ordeal had been difficult, but now she had a sense of peace. This was what justice felt like, and as the elevator doors closed behind her, Grace knew she could finally leave the past behind and move forward. As Grace entered the penthouse suite, the weight of the day's events slowly began to lift from her shoulders. The luxurious space was a stark contrast to the harshness she had faced in the lobby, but it was more than just the comfort of the room that began to ease her. It was the restoration of her dignity. In that moment, she realized the power of standing up for oneself in the face of injustice. Grace had been wronged, treated as though she didn't belong simply because of who she was. But she didn't let that define her. Instead of shrinking or walking away, Grace stood tall, demanding the respect she knew she deserved. Her actions weren't just about a hotel room or an apology. They were about reclaiming her worth and ensuring that no one could diminish her. The story of Grace's experience is a reminder of the importance of self-respect. It teaches us that we are all worthy of dignity, regardless of the circumstances. When faced with discrimination, it's easy to feel powerless, to be silenced by the weight of unjust treatment. But Grace's resilience showed that silence is not always the answer. Speaking out, even when it's uncomfortable, is necessary to fight for justice and equality. Grace's decision to stand her ground and not accept unfair treatment sends a powerful message to everyone. It reminds us that we must never allow others to define our worth. When we encounter injustice, we have the power to rise above it. Grace didn't just get her room that night. She reminded us all that standing up for our rights is not only empowering but essential. Her resilience is a lesson to us all. When we face adversity, we must find our voice, stand firm, and never accept being made to feel less than what we are. In the end, Grace's journey wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming her right to be treated with respect. And in doing so, she set an example for all of us.